live with Wine Guy Mike here in the tasting room, and as I alluded to earlier, I got a tasty show for you. Hashtag local tasty. I've got my friends Don Van Nice and Andree Van Nice, Earth Oven Breads, in the tasting room live with us today, Sunday at noon. And hi, Andree. She's waving at me. And Don, I can see him on Skype. Just pretend you can see him and lift up your hand and wave to him today. They were nice enough on fairly short notice to jump in with me. I've been teasing Don for weeks about wanting him to be my guest on here, and I think he probably didn't think it was really going to happen, but I just wanted to get all the kinks worked out before we got going with that, and we do. And so we've brought some nice new technology here to the tasting room that we're going to be able to podcast and YouTube up here in the near term. So I get to eat Don's bread every week. He delivers a loaf to me, and Don and his wife Andree, they have a booth down at the original farmers market down by the X's. They're down there on Sundays. And Don, where else are you? You do a midweek farmers market as well with your breads?
That's right. I started off 6 years ago baking bread and selling it at the farmers market. But I've always baked our bread. But starting to bake it in quantity required a larger oven, and that's when I built that large Adobe oven back in 2009. And so we've been selling bread at the farmers market for 6 years now, enjoying that every Saturday morning, and also the winter market, which is a feature that Missoula brings to the local folks for getting out some products during the winter. And then quite a while back, one of my customers asked if he could. How could he get my bread in the wintertime? And I said, well, I guess I could start a delivery service. And I started this Wednesday delivery service. I run it on emails. And I send out emails to like 70 of my customers. And anybody who wants bread that week sends me back an email. And I get to, I go around and deliver a fresh loaf of bread straight out of the oven to their home before dinner time at 5 o'clock. It's a fun time.
Yeah, and it's fun when it comes in nice and warm. And we're going to circle back to that in just a second. And I did a little homework this week in preparation for our show with Earth Oven Bread. And I just want to mention, before we get into that piece of it, that it's very interesting with bread because there's a lot of commonality with wine with it. And, our show's a little Anthony Bourdain-esque here in the tasting room. We talk about food, we talk about wine. Well, we talk about anything we want to, really, Don. But for our listeners out there, I just want to give you a little background and kind of go through the beginning of time with bread and weave some of that in until we come up to today, really. But during the Neolithic period, which was between 10,000 BC and 4,000 BC, a major shift took place in food production and consumption. Humans transitioned from hunters and gatherers to fixed agrarian-based communities. The grains began to be harvested by food, so people were out there literally scavenging the fields and looking for grains that they could harvest to eat. Boiling the grains, so they knew that boiling them made them a little more palatable and easier to digest, and it would also give them more nutrition. So it was sort of like making porridge, if you will. As time went on, the process for preparing these grains, porridge was cooked on stone slabs, making really crude flatbreads that were less prone to spoilage, and they could be transported that way for trade and for consumption. The advances in the bread making laid the groundwork for the Egyptians and the Greeks that came in and were really innovators of bread, and that leads us into the period of antiquity between 5500 BC and 300 AD. The Egyptians and the Greeks experimented with a lot of different ingredients and techniques. The Egyptian flatbreads were made from wheat, barley, spelt flour, salt, and water, and they were kneaded much like Don does every week with his hands, and they use their feet too, and Don might use his feet. I don't know. He's going to tell us a little bit about that. And they baked them on stone slabs. But during this time, the diversity of ingredients that were available allowed for the creativity in baking breads, if you will. And it supercharged the artistic element of bread making. Advances in understanding of fermentation led to the important development of leavened breads. Leavened breads were made from about 1500 BC onward. So now, Don, circling back to you and what you do, first tell us a little bit about your life background. I believe you told me you were in the armed services. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, that was back in the 70s. And a lot of things happened to me back in the 70s, all mostly good. And back in 1972, I met my wife, Andree, a French woman, and we married and started our life here in Montana. We had been here for a while when I was drafted into the Army, and when I got out of the Army, Andree took me to France, and that was the first time this boy from Montana had ever tasted such good bread. I went nuts. The pastries, the bread, the wine, the cheeses, all the flavors of France, that they were making. And so when we came back from France, in Montana in the early 70s, you couldn't get any good bread. There was no Petit Bout and some of these great Harvest bakeries and things like that, and Black Cat. So I started experimenting, looking for recipes and baking bread. Well, Andree had also taken me to her baker, and he pointed out one important thing back then was that a little bit of dough from the previous batch is saved for the next batch. In other words, it's lightly sourdough. And my father was always a sourdough guy, and so I was also a sourdough guy, and so I started making my bread sourdough from the very beginning. I was always baking just our loaves of bread, enough for ourselves and our friends, and it's been 44 years of wonderful baking, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But yes, it has a real connection with me and my wife, and just good eating, good ingredients, everything that comes together to make good bread.
And Don, after you got out of the service in the 70s, then I believe you went on and worked with the Forest Service as a cartographer. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Had 32 years with the Forest Service, making maps of northern Idaho and Montana for all those 32 years. A very interesting career at the time.
Let me ask you, when we talk about wine on the tasting room here, we talk a lot about sense of place, what the French refer to as terroir. And is there any sense of place for you with bread baking?
Oh, yes, very much. I grew up in south central Montana, Laurel, Montana, and right above Laurel, and for hundreds of miles is all the wheat you can imagine. Wheat fields as far as you can see. And so one of my first experiments here was finding out good flour. Well, Wheat Montana came along back in the, I think, 80s, and I have found that Wheat Montana flour is one of the best flours around, and I've stuck with exclusively baking with their products.
Yeah, their products are darn good, aren't they? We live in a wonderful state here in Montana, and we're very blessed to do so. I want to talk for a minute a little bit about fermentation next, and just for our listeners out there, fermentation occurs when the yeast and the bacteria inside the dough convert the carbohydrates, which are the sugars and the salts, to carbon dioxide, causing gas bubbles to form. And then this has a leavening effect on the dough. This process is very similar to wine, beer, and sauerkraut, and causes a strong aromatic sensation that usually is pleasing. The gas bubbles expand inside the dough then, and they make the dough appear larger. They puff up or leaven. And there are two theories for the origins of leavened bread dating back to the Antiquity period. One is that Egyptian beer was added in lieu of water, thus introducing yeast into the dough. And the second theory is a piece of dough was forgotten, leavened by ambient yeast, and later baked. This development ultimately gave the Egyptian bread a new dimension with new possibilities. And for the Greeks, they used wine in their bread-making process, whereas the Gauls and the Liberians used the foam around atop the ale for dough fermentation. And I found that very interesting in my research, and just love that there's that connection between the bread, because for me, Don, a perfect meal is bread, grapes, maybe some Braeburn apples, and some great triple creme French cheese and wine. So, it doesn't get any better than that for me. How about you?
Oh, that's true. I mean, we don't have a meal without bread here. We find if we don't have a piece of bread, we start to get grumpy. And it makes a good bread makes a good meal. It goes so well with so many things, and I like the fermentation thing is very, very important. Starting my sourdough the day before, it produces a little bit of alcohol in my bread. It adds an extra flavor that you can't get in just a regular bread. And then baking it in that big Adobe oven, the wood-fired Adobe oven in my backyard, adds more flavor to the crust. So you've got the beautifully leavened bread that I've mixed and kneaded in the bakery, and then baking in that large Adobe oven just adds all the flavor to it. So it's a combination of all that, and the yeast is super important in baking bread. And timing.
And let me ask, so you use a little sourdough starter, so would you consider your bread a sourdough bread?
I do. I call it lightly sourdough. That depends on how long you sour your dough and what proportion of sourdough you put into your bread to make the bread. Now, a lot of sourdough can actually retard the growth of bread, so you have to be careful about how much sourdough, what proportion of sourdough you're using, but it does add just an extra flavor to flour, yeast, salt, and water.
Which brings up a question for me, not knowing much about bread, other than I like that it ferments like wine that I love so dearly. And that's why I love having you and Andree on the show, because you guys are so passionate, and I'm passionate about wine. And, being Italian, I love to eat, so I love the bread. But why are some sourdoughs more sour than others?
Well, there is a variety of yeast cultures. The yeast, there's wild yeast in the air all around us all the time, and just like all the other bacteria. And it's what will add the flavor to your bread. So you've got two things: the quality of the yeast, the type of yeast you're using, and the quantity of sourdough that you put into the loaf of bread. So I don't want to make mine like a San Francisco sourdough. I make it a lightly sourdough bread, and it just adds that much more flavor to it.
Yeah, when I eat your bread every week, I would really never know that it's sourdough. I just know that it's gone shortly once I start slicing it. Because Don brings me my bread, and it's usually warm out of the oven, and I love you for that, Don. Thank you. And that bread is just so good with butter. We're not talking about health today necessarily. We're eating for the health of it, but I'm Italian. I live to eat. I don't eat to live. So it's,
Right.
we just love good food and butter and bread. And so with the yeast, how does that all work? I mean, are there a lot of different yeast strains that you buy for bread, Don, or that you make, or how does that all work?
Well, the yeast doesn't flavor the bread at all. It's pretty much baked out or gone by the time you bake the bread. But the yeast has to do a lot with the temperature, the timing, and I just call baking bread is a lot like life. It's all in the timing. You have to know what the ingredient, all the temperature of your ingredients, the temperature of your air, even the sometimes I feel that stormy days are better for baking bread than hot, dry days, because the air pressure is better, or something combines with the bread to make it a little bit better. But the various, I just use a commercial yeast, and then very good flour, because that's my main ingredient, the Wheat Montana unbleached white flour, and then let the timing begin on baking bread.
Well, that's one major difference between wine and bread then, because using yeast in wines is the main thing, other than some barrel influence, that really imparts both aroma and flavor into wines. And that's why a lot of younger winemakers like Sarah Hedges Goodhart, we had as a guest last week, and she makes a native yeast starter from her grapes to do the fermentation of her wines with, which I found very interesting. So, Don, not knowing a lot about that, so you have a starter, and then take me through the process from A to Z with baking your breads when you get your sourdough starter going, and then what happens?
Okay, so yeah, the day before you add your sourdough and get it fermenting. It ferments overnight in 2 large stainless steel bowls, and then the next day I'm starting the oven at 8 o'clock in the morning, firing up my wood oven. At the same time, I'm starting to mix my dough. So it takes you let the yeast plenty of time to dissolve in the water. To grow in the water, and the water temperature at that point is quite warm, like 110 degrees. I'm mixing the dough, and I use, it's kind of interesting, my wife is a ceramic artist, and she has a ceramic clay mixing machine in the studio that she hasn't used in years, and it's all stainless steel. It has a geared down motor. It has a large vat in it that I can mix the dough in, and does a beautiful job of mixing my dough. So I took over her ceramic clay mixer as my dough mixer. I couldn't do this job without that. It mixes 40 to 50 pounds of dough at a time, and so the dough is mixing. That takes 45 minutes or so, and then you have to let it start rising. And so I give the first one an autolyze of about 45 minutes, just to let the dough rest in the pan and start rising. Then I knead the dough, and that takes another hour or so to knead all that dough. And then I've got everything rising in the background. And so this is the first rising of, let's say, second rising of the dough. And then I make the loaves. That's around 12 o'clock. I start making the loaves. So you have to time all this out. If I'm going to make 45 loaves of bread, I have to let some of the loaves be rising while my other main dough is still sitting there. And there again, timing. I let the loaves rise for about an hour, and then they're ready to start going into the oven. At the same time, the oven has been coming down to temperature, and I have to kind of watch that. If it's too hot in my oven, I have to open the door and let some heat out. But when the oven comes down to about 512 degrees, that's when I can start baking in it. And I use a thermal gun to tell the temperature of my oven, and I start the baking process. The first loaves are really dark. They're very intense because it's so hot in there. And these are my prized loaves. Some of my customers just love these very dark, bold loaves of bread that have actually an extra flavor to them again, because as I say, as I approach the oven, it starts to smell like there's coffee roasting. When this bread is done, it is so dark that the caramelization of the dough is giving extra flavor to it, and it's another smell that's like beautiful. And then after that, the oven cools down to around below 500 degrees, and I just start baking in it for hours and run all the loaves through.
I want to add something. When you go to France, if you go into some of the little villages, especially in the more native areas, you will find bread. Some of these bakeries are amazing. They are out in the middle of nowhere, and they serve black bread. And we have to try it, because I have never seen bread that black in the towns, in the cities, and it's delicious. You think it's burnt, and it is not. It is so delicious, and it's really sought after.
I wonder, Andree, if it's sort of like wines. You know, there are wines for people that are just getting into wine that I like to introduce them with, and then I take them out to more complex wines that a younger, less experienced palate, if you will, it's almost too much for it. So I wonder if those black breads are sort of the same way. You know, you just have that complexity.
Yeah, you don't know until you try it.
You know, when I sell bread at the market, I always ask people if they've had it before. If they look completely new to me and they're not sure what they are buying, I'll start them on a medium loaf, not the dark ones right away, because they have to develop.
Yeah, so kind of to my point, the same sort of thing. So, Don, do you have a waiting list for people that can buy your breads, or how does that work? Are you full up now, or is there room for some newcomers?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I'm a one-man show here, and I do have limits. And first of all, this is just a hobby. I have to mention that. But it's grown into such a hobby that I'm spending 3 days a week at it. And that's about what I want to be doing. During the winter, I was selling around 60 loaves a week between my bread delivery service and the winter market. This spring, I'm already starting baking more bread than I ever have for the beginning of the summer market. And last year, I was up to 110 loaves a week, which is about my max. I think that's as much bread as I can bake in a week.
That's a lot of bread, my friend. And I want to ask you, how do you like to enjoy your bread at home? Do you like peanut butter and jelly? Do you like Andree's jams? What do you do with your bread, Don?
Well, a difficult question, Mike. I like it with just butter on it. Peanut butter and jelly at least once a day. I always have to have my peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And because we moved out here to this little property, we have a small orchard here, which it produces more fruit than we can eat. So my wife Andree has been making jam from our orchard. 100% fruit right from the jam. You can still find chunks of the fruit in it, you know. Little bit of sugar, no extra ingredients added, because we cook the fruit down until it thickens itself and becomes the jam. And so, you know, I always have a jar of fresh jam in the fridge. It's just delicious to have on my bread. And then, of course, there's the cheeses. You can have all the wonderful triple creme, Epoise, Libero, some of the soft cheeses, the camemberts, just spread on this bread. And bread is a vehicle that carries other food. That's the interesting thing about bread. It doesn't have a lot of flavor itself, but it's this vehicle that you can use your hands to hold this other food with it. By itself, bread isn't much, but you add something to it. Yeah, no, good bread is, you add something to it, and it's just like the best combination.
Well, and you've brought up a couple of good points, and I want to digress for just a moment to my history of bread a little bit, which I think complements your points that you've just made. So, for the Egyptians and the Greeks, it was clear that in order to keep order in the streets, if you will, it was easier to maintain the food need, maintaining the streets and stuff. They fed the people. That's what they did. If you didn't feed the people, society was a little bit more difficult. There was an ancient Egyptian saying, "He whose belly is empty complains loudest." Therefore, the grain production was given the highest priority in the Egyptian socio-economic stratosphere, if you will. Bread was such an important component for religious celebration. Ramses III, for example, sacrificed 200,000 loaves of bread a year, which is amazing. That's a lot of baking, Don. And the importance of the bread to the Greeks and the Egyptians was passed on to the Romans, who created guild-like organizations that ensured quality of the bread production and innovation. Roman rulers would say, and I'm going to, forgive me with my Latin here, but it's panem acercanus, which means bread and circuses. This was in references to the superficial means of appeasement that they would provide to the people in order to gain their support. So in the Middle Ages, from 500 AD to 1500 AD, was a great time of fluctuation for grain availability, production, and consumption. The nomadic barbarians, whose diets consisted mostly of meat, along with famine, bad weather, and disease, were some of the hallmarks of that period that really led to the decline in availability and demand for bread. But by the end of this era, the growing urbanization of society, the creation of bakers' guilds, and technological advances in ovens contributed to greater demand for breads. Agriculture was reintroduced by the Catholic Church around 1000 AD, and bread was needed for the important sacrament of communion, and the Catholic clergy were learning from agricultural texts written by their Greco-Roman ancestors. By 1100 AD, the demand for bread was rapidly on the rise. There was a distinction made between bakers, they were the fornari, and the dough makers were the pistores, and laws were introduced to moderate the disruptive behavior that occasionally erupted between the two groups, which I thought was interesting. The fornari and the pistores had to pay taxes, and they were required to submit to regular inspections, so that they were ensuring that the weights of the breads were honest. And the first Bakers' Guild formed in France was around 1200 AD, and it was called the tamallier, which means flour sifters. To become a tamallier, one had to go through a 4-year apprenticeship, pass a number of tests, and be granted the right to bake from the king, which I found very interesting. Baking was viewed as a very honorable profession. In the bakers' guilds, they enjoyed many benefits. For example, a baker who supplied bread to hospitals. In return, they were given free medical care. And bread in the 13th century contained mostly wheat, and the richer you were, the whiter the bread was. Poor people, on the other hand, ate whole wheat breads containing lots of bran and wheat germ, which was interesting too. So the poor people, they really got the better bread in a way. It's interesting to note, though, that it's been scientifically proven, as I just said, that the whole wheat bread is better for you. So the production of bread was well established. Bakers began to explore specialty items like sweetbreads, braids, pastries. They quickly became super popular all over Europe, and bakers began to enrich doughs with eggs, dairy, honey, sometimes sugar that was brought back from the Crusades. And by the end of the Middle Ages, laws concerning the production of bread were being written by royalty and guilds that were clearly developed and respected organizations. So I found in my research that was all really interesting stuff, and there's just so many parallels. History repeats itself, right? So it's good research you did there, Mike. Just as a side note, one of our trips to Europe, we did a trip into Italy, and we came by Pompeii, and that's one of those
historical places in the world where it was so well preserved because of the lava flows there. And when they dug it out, the whole city is very, very complete in paintings and architecture. And one of the places we visited was a bakery in Pompeii. And I got to see the large stone bowls that they had for proofing their bread. There was the oven out behind. I mean, the whole thing just felt like, every time I'm baking bread, I feel like I'm one of those ancient Romans, producing their bread for their customers. It has a great feel to it. Also, as we traveled around Europe, I photographed Adobe ovens everywhere we traveled. And like even down in New Mexico, near Albuquerque, we visited a Pueblo dwelling that had a huge beehive oven in the middle. Interesting pieces around the world that are just fabulous to see how people have continued this tradition of bread baking.
And you built your oven, I'm assuming, Don, and correct me if I'm wrong here, based on things that you saw in Europe, the different ovens, and you must have been
Correct.
inspired and you came home and built this amazing oven. And one of the things that we're going to do when I have the video and the podcast from our show here edited, we'll also have a video that was so beautifully done and was played at the Big Sky Documentary Film Festival on the last night, that was of all about you and Andree and Earth Oven Bread, and the filmmakers did a beautiful job. It really almost brought me to tears, actually. It was a very moving piece of film.
It was one of my bread customers, who's also a friend of mine, Eric Bristow, and his wife Geneva, are documentary filmmakers. I didn't know this until they told me one day, and they said, "We want to make this documentary about your bread baking." I thought, oh, that's silly, but he came out and did a lot of interviews. He did the filming, he and his wife, and put this thing together. And at the time, I didn't know where they were going to go with this. It sounded like it's just a personal project. But then he entered it into the Big Sky Film Festival and got into a really interesting group at the finale of the film festival on Sunday. It was a group called Made in Montana. And it's a little 6.5-minute film, beautifully done, and they did a great job on this thing. I can't thank Eric and Geneva enough for their wonderful documentation of my bread baking efforts here.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I mean, it just, honestly, it was, and knowing you and Andree, it was a very moving short piece. I actually watched it 2 or 3 times this morning as I was preparing for our conversation here in the tasting room, and we're going to take a little break. We are back in the... Yeah. Andree, I want to welcome you into the tasting room with WineGuyMike. And we've been talking to your husband, Don, master bread baker, and, he just, I don't know, though, Don, you haven't done good things for my waistline. That's the only problem. That bread is just so good that, I eat it by the loaf, not by the slice, okay? I'm just saying.
It's good for your willpower.
So, Andree, tell me a little bit about your garden and your fruit trees, and you're an integral part of Earth Oven Breads because you are with Don all the time, helping him. I know you run the business side of the business, but you're creative in your own right. You're a ceramicist, and you make these incredible jams and things that I want our listeners to learn about, so when they see you down at the original farmers market on Saturdays by the X's, they can partake in what it is that you make and bring to the table, literally. Tell us a little bit about that.
What I find incredible, as you say, about my jams is that I make them basically using just the fruit. I don't even use commercial pectin. because I find, I grew up on homemade jam that my mother would make from usually my grandmother's garden, and it was so good. All you need to do, I can get used to the taste of commercial pectin, and it's usually the commercial jams are too sweet for me. So I like to taste my fruit, not just sugar, and I prefer not to use the commercial pectin, so you have to cook them a little longer and caramelize that sugar a little more. And you get a very rich flavor, usually. It's tricky, and that's why I'm getting up all the time here, because actually I am in the process of making jam right now, and I don't want it to stick. So I'm getting up every once in a while to stir.
Our first crop of rhubarb is
Yes.
coming in.
Yeah, we have.
So it's
we
the
have a
new
lot of
rhubarb
fruit trees.
jam.
And you just have to cook it a little longer. When things like rhubarb or raspberries are particularly tricky, or cherry, because they have very little pectin, natural pectin in there. So you have to cook them longer. Also, I keep the skin. That's where all the pectin is. So if you keep the skin, you're going to have a really nice gel. And if really you're having a tough time getting it to set, use a little bit of applesauce. I'd rather use a little bit of applesauce, which I have from our garden, than commercial
For
products. And it won't change the flavor, but it really allows the jam to thicken up a little bit faster.
That is extremely interesting. And again, I'm going to tie it back to wine. So, is pectin, is that like a tannin in the wine that comes from the grapes? It's that tannin in wines is that tactile sensation that you feel in your mouth. It's not a flavor, but it's just that. So I'm wondering, and it comes from the fruit being in contact with the grape skins or stems and seeds, and I'm wondering now, I've never thought about that, but I wonder if pectin is a form of a tannin that you use to make your lovely jams with. And the other thing that's really interesting to hear as I sit here in face-to-face with you, literally virtually in the tasting room, but the way you make your jams is similar to old world thought process, being more restrained in winemaking, and using some of the native yeast as opposed to commercial inoculated yeast in wines that really lets the fruit express itself and its terroir, the sense of place, if you will.
Some of these wild yeast when I harvest, for instance, probably the easiest jam to make is the plums, the Italian plums particularly, because they have this rich skin. That's where all the pectin is. This jam happens so fast, and the skins, I make sure the plums are clean, but I don't overwash them or anything. I want to keep some of these wild flavor that just come from the rain and just from growing outside. So I think the quality of the fruit that we use also makes a big difference. I don't have lemon juice because I don't think it needs it. Here, people tend to add all kinds of things to their jams, and it changes the flavors I'm used to. So I want, when I make apricot or plum jam, I want to taste the apricot, I want to taste the peach, I want to taste the cherry. So another thing you can do if you don't want to use commercial pectin, is you can combine a fruit. And if I have a lot, I will do that. I combine a fruit which has a lot of pectin with what that doesn't, like the gooseberry. The gooseberries are very nice, but they don't have a lot of pectin. Same for the raspberries, same for the chocolate. Combine them with other things, and then it makes it a lot easier. Give you a different flavor too. Just adds to the variety of flavors that you can provide.
Well, I'm going to have to do some more homework now because your comments have me so curious about the comparison between pectin and tannins, because it's just like grapes. Some varietals of grapes have far greater amounts of tannin that they impart to the fruit than others. So that is really, really fascinating to me. Tell our listeners today, what flavors of jams do you make? And obviously it's seasonal. You know, Don just mentioned that rhubarb's coming in, so we're going to have some rhubarb jam, I guess. And so what other flavors do you do?
Well, the rhubarb, I'm just making it right now. Last week, I love the early rhubarb because it's so red and it has far better flavor than the, let's say, end of the summer rhubarb, which is much cleaner. Let's say the next one to come is probably going to be the cherries. Cherry jam can be so intense. It's wonderful. The cherries, and then we'll get the apricots. And this year we may or may not get peaches. I don't know. We had a super big crop last year, and some of these trees in Montana, they take a vacation once in a while. So we might have a few peaches, but not anything like last year. But lots of leftover from last year. And then, let's say, then comes the raspberries and the blueberries. We grow blueberries too and strawberries, but it's them all.
Mm-hmm.
So I rarely have enough to make jam.
Now don't forget your golden plum.
The golden plum too. They are
The
incredibly fabulous. And then the last ones are these Italian plums, which, you know, in France we call them quetch. They are these big red oblong plants, and they come. Sometimes we pick them. It's slow, and they're just now ripe because you have to let the frost hit them a couple times for them to develop the sweetness that you need for prunes and things like that. And they are, they are the best tree for Montana because they always come.
So again, there's such a similarity between the frost and the fruit. So, you know, like ice wines and late harvest wines, you know, that have extended hang time and stuff on the vines, and it just drives the sugar through the roof in those fruits, and they make these beautiful sauternes and late harvest wines. And yeah, I know I'd get you with sauternes. Just we wine lovers love them, don't we?
Or one of our favorites that we found in southern France is called Banyuls.
Oh,
and it's a red wine, and it's brewed to 18 and 19%. It's not fortified wine like a port. It's brewed because the grapes are so sugar filled that they can take this up to that percentage, and it's a delightful sweet wine.
Better than port.
That'll take you on a trip and never have to leave home, Don, with 18 or 19% alcohol. and Andree, I want to ask another question about your jams, because Don mentioned something earlier, and I love to do this. I love to take my soft cheeses like the triple creme and spread that on Don's bread, the earth oven bread, like it's butter, and there is just nothing better than that for me. But what if I were going to incorporate a jam? Would that be okay? I'm all about breaking rules, so even if it's not okay. But what jam would you recommend would be best to do that with?
You know, more than the jam, say with a relatively mild. I would do that, let's say, with a French Monster, which is like Limburger or an Époisse or Limau. They're too strong. I would do that with maybe a Brie, you know. But now I've never seen the French, or a triple creme, which is a type of Brie. I've never seen the French do that, but hey, try it. If you like the combination of cheese, but I would not do it with a super heavy flavor, because I think you're going to lose the strong, pungent flavor of your cheese if you do that. And I hate to say I am into very strong, pungent cheese. So don't spoil the liver or
My Sicilian grandmother loved very strong, pungent cheese. Also, she loved Limburger cheese. We could hardly stay in the house when we were kids. It was just, if she wanted to get rid of the kids, that's how she'd do it. Bust out the Limburger cheese.
This is the first cheese that I loved in America because I couldn't find my Alsatian Munster. And the Munster in France is like Limburger.
Oh, man.
And every time I ate it, I had to get out of the house. He said,
I love it. That is so great. And believe it or not, we're out of time for the tasting room this Sunday. And I want to encourage everybody to visit Don and Andree down at the X's at the original farmers market each and every Saturday for breads and jams that they're out of this world, and they're otherworldly, really, is what they are. And they're made with love and passion. And to me, that's what my friends Don and Andree represent. Just that love and the passion for what they do. And I want to thank you guys for being here on the tasting room today. It's been a pleasure. And I hope you'll come back again next season so we can talk about what happens, because everything changes from vintage to vintage, whether it's breads or jams or wines, whatever we're talking about here. You've been incredible guests. I love you guys, and I have a great Sunday afternoon, and thanks for being here with all of our listeners and imparting all this love and knowledge to them on the Tasting Room Show. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye.